Hey everybody, Professor Moore here, and today I want to talk about how during the height of the COVID-19 pandemic, a lot of public figures outed themselves as being completely ignorant about the reality of slavery by comparing national lockdown and stay-at-home orders to being enslaved. For example, the singer Morrissey said, "COVID society is the precise description of slavery." During the same time, Trump's Attorney General William Barr criticized the decision of states to go on lockdown. He argued a national lockdown and stay-at-home orders is like house arrest. Other than slavery, which was a different kind of restraint, it's the greatest intrusion on civil liberties in American history. During an anti-COVID lockdown protest in California, one woman even held up a sign that said, "Muzzles are for dogs and slaves. I am a free human being." Now, what that sign was suggesting is that wearing a mask to stop the spread of COVID is the same as an enslaved black person having an iron muzzle put over their face. What these examples show me is that there are so many people that know absolutely nothing about the reality of slavery. If they knew the truth about slavery, they could never make comments or comparisons like these. But this is nothing new. Something similar happened in 2013 when US politician Sarah Palin argued that the national debt would turn future generations into the slaves of China. She said, "When that money comes due, and this isn't racist, but it'll be like slavery when that note is due. We are going to be beholden to a foreign master." MSNBC host Martin Bashir lost his job over his response to Palin's comment. He said, "When Mrs. Palin invokes slavery, she doesn't just prove her rank ignorance. She confirms if anyone truly qualified for a dose of discipline from Thomas Thistlewood, she would be the outstanding candidate." So why did this comment get Martin Bashir fired? Who was Thomas Thistlewood? Thomas Thistlewood was a British plantation owner in Jamaica in the 1700s who kept meticulous diaries where he recorded all of the torture that he inflicted on the enslaved people that he owned. When Martin Bashir suggested that Sarah Palin needed a dose of Thistlewood's punishment to understand the brutality of slavery, he was referring to a specific torture technique that Thistlewood invented called Derby's dose. In his book, Mastery, Tyranny, and Desire, Thomas Thistlewood and His Slaves in the Anglo-Jamaican World, author Trevor Bernard utilizes Thistlewood's diaries to explain how this punishment came to be. In the book, we learn that Thistlewood gave one of his slaves a moderate whipping, pickled him well, then made a slave named Hector shit in his mouth. Thistlewood immediately put in a gag when the slave's mouth was full and made him wear it for 4 or 5 hours. An enslaved woman named Phyllis was given the same treatment minus the gag a day later. 6 days later, Hector was himself punished for losing a gardening tool. Thistlewood inducted a new slave, Joe, into the horrors of slavery by having Joe piss into Hector's eyes and mouth. The same day, July 30th, 1756, Thistlewood whipped 2 slaves and washed and rubbed in salt pickle, lime juice, and bird pepper. On August 1st, Thistlewood caught a runaway slave and put him in chains, gagged him, rubbed him with molasses, and exposed him naked to the flies all day and the mosquitoes all night without fire. The circle of degradation was completed on August 27th when Derby, the first recipient of the punishment that Thistlewood named after him, was made to shit in the mouth of a slave named Egypt, who had shit in his mouth 7 months earlier. Now let's go back to this woman who compared wearing a mask during COVID-19 to an enslaved person wearing a muzzle. If she had read the diaries of Thomas Thistlewood, she would have never made this comparison because she would have known about the torture, trauma, and violence of slavery. Now, it's important to note that Thomas Thistlewood was not seen as a monster during his lifetime. He was seen as a respectable, upstanding member of his community. He was seen as a progressive man of the Enlightenment who loved to read and considered himself an amateur scientist. But at the same time, he was torturing the enslaved people that he owned. And not only that, but in his diary, he recorded how he assaulted hundreds of women on countless occasions. Thistlewood was truly a man of his times. He was a master of torture. And what's so shocking is that for decades, the word torture was generally not associated with slavery. As historian Edward E. Baptist notes in his masterpiece, The Half Has Never Been Told, Slavery and the Making of American Capitalism, torture walked right behind enslaved people. But neither their contemporaries then, nor historians since, have used torture to describe the violence applied by enslavers. Yet we should call torture by its name. When discussing this daily torture with my students in the classroom, I always rely on primary source historical documents. Thistlewood's diary is certainly one of the most important sources that we have, but even more important are the voices of those who were enslaved. These sources directly contradict the lies of plantation owners who claim that they treated their slaves good and almost treated them like family. Plantation owners love to say publicly that they rarely used violence against their slaves, but the evidence tells a different story. I want to share some of this evidence with you, and while I'm reading from these slave memoirs, I'm going to be showing you pictures that were drawn by abolitionists during that time period that were trying to draw attention to the brutality and horrors of slavery. Solomon Northup was enslaved on a Louisiana plantation for 12 years, and he described how it was rarely that a day passed by without one or more whippings. The lash is flying from morning until night the whole day long. In the cotton fields, Northup described how if one falls behind or is a moment idle, he is whipped. Whenever a new slave is put into the field, he is whipped up smartly and made for that day to pick as fast as he possibly can. Even when this backbreaking labor is done, Northup noted that after the weighing of the cotton follow the whippings. And it wasn't just plantation owners or overseers who wielded the whip. Northup explains that a slave caught off his master's plantation without a pass may be seized and whipped by any white man whom he meets. Any white woman could also whip an enslaved person at any time for any reason. In her memoir describing her time as a slave, Harriet Jacobs described how an enslaved person could be whipped for absolutely anything. An enslaved person could be whipped if they prepared a meal and the master did not like it. They could be whipped for teaching others to read. They could be whipped if they were found outside their quarters after 9 p.m. And the torture never stopped, as Jacob explains. Everywhere, men, women, and children were whipped till the blood stood in puddles at their feet. Some received 500 lashes. In 1863, an enslaved man known as Whipped Peter was photographed showing the years of scars on his back from constant whippings and torture. We know that these whippings were not about discipline or punishment. They were about torture and sadism. Frederick Douglass tells us that, "I have seen the overseer whip a woman causing the blood to run half an hour at a time, and this too in the midst of her crying children, pleading for their mother's release. He seemed to take pleasure in manifesting his fiendish barbarity." We know that enslavers took pleasure in this torture because, like Thomas Thistlewood, they were constantly inventing new ways to cause pain. Here's a drawing depicting a form of torture called cat hauling, where enslavers would take a starving cat and place it on an enslaved person's back to scratch it to pieces. Now, some people might argue that this video is nothing more than trauma porn. But pornography is something that you get pleasure out of. I don't know about you, but I take no pleasure in relaying this information. I look at my role as a historian as a sacred duty to educate people about the reality of the past. I tell these stories to push back against states like Florida that are trying to teach children that slavery actually benefited the people who were enslaved. It didn't. It benefited their white enslavers. They benefited from the torture of black bodies and used the profits from that torture to build our modern world. I tell these stories to fight back against states like Texas that are trying to get rid of the word slavery and replace it with forced relocation. These people want you to think that the worst part of slavery was being forced to work against your will. But that is only half of the story. The other half of the story is one of torture, sadism, and white pleasure and black pain. And it's only when we tell that half of the story when the true history of slavery will ever be known.